So I will talk a little bit now about what defamiliarization is. So one way we can describe it is as a shift in perception that allows one to perceive something differently, as if for the first time. I wrote a book which came out last year, which was called Queer Defamiliarization, Writing, Mattering, Making Strange. Now, in that book, I approached this concept from a number of different perspectives and tried to mobilize it in different ways. This was my own specific reading of the concept, which I can go into and talk about. It's not the only way that one can talk about this concept. So I asked a question here: how can one defamiliarize? And the answer is in multiple ways: in space, in time, in text, in body, in image, in sensation, in perception, in construction, in figuration, in fantasy, in drama, in poetry, in expression, in gesture, in gender, in style, in shape. And there are lots more. Perhaps you can also think of ways that one could defamiliarize. So that's a very basic introduction. And what we will do when we start reading texts, we will look at a text written by this guy, Viktor Shklovsky, who's a Russian writer from the early 20th century. It's called Art as Device, and I will put this text. First of all, I have the PDF, which I can share around with you. I will put it in the chat at the end of the session today, and I will also make sure it's on TIS for you and also on Tubel. So there are many ways you can access this PDF, and then we will discuss this next week. For now, all you need to know is that Viktor Shklovsky is the one who invented this modern way of thinking about defamiliarization. So in the Russian, ostranenie, and that's the Russian way of writing it there. And then it's been translated in multiple ways. So defamiliarization is one way, and then you have estrangement and also estrangement and also making strange, the title of our course. Two linked words in German, Verfremdung and Entfremdung, different, but both linked possibly by different writers and thinkers, linked to the idea of defamiliarization or estrangement. So we will talk about those as we go along. We will talk about them a little bit more next week. So very briefly, in the 19th century, if you think about literature for a minute, this is a long quotation. I won't read it all for you, but the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in 1817, he talks about the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects. So that's again an idea about freshness, or perceiving an old and familiar object in a new way, in an exciting way. So that's what this device of defamiliarization can do. And then similarly, Percy Bysshe Shelley, a few years later, he talks about poetry and how it strips the veil of familiarity from the world. So again, familiarity, you can see that part of familiar is the same as in the word defamiliarization, stripping the veil of familiarity from the world is making us see it or perceive the world in a different way. And poetry, he says poetry can do this. So poetry itself can defamiliarize. So that's worth thinking about. And then we have in the 20th century, someone who I have called an arch defamiliarizer, as in she is, one could say, a queen of defamiliarization, Gertrude Stein. And the kind of defamiliarization she does is in the syntax of a sentence, for example. So you have like and like, likely and likely, likely and likely, like and like. And then you have, it is very likely that nearly everyone has been very nearly certain that something that is interesting them. And then the last example from Stein, I know since, I know since when, I know since when since, I know since when since, I know since when since, I know since, I know since when since, I know 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 since. So in these examples, Gertrude Stein is playing with the language. She's defamiliarizing each of these words so that they take on an entirely different feeling, a different meaning, a different sensation. In the repetition of the words, it becomes somehow something else. So this is just one example of defamiliarization in language, in text. So if we are to think about, so one of you talked about the quotation I put in the video, the introduction video, which is here. In order to transform an object into a fact of art, it is necessary to detach it from the domain of life, to wrest it out from the web of familiar associations, to turn over the object as one would turn over a log in the fire. And this is from the text which we will read for next week, Victor Schlofke's Art as Device. So if we think about it as a device and we think, what are the mechanics of this device? It's a process whereby you detach. So you detach it, decontextualize it, wrest it out. So this is another kind of pulling it out motion, and then turn it over. So all of those things are a way of seeing how this device might work. And we could do this. We could create this process with a word, with an image, with a body, with all of those examples that I listed at the beginning. So I'll show you an example of bodily or somatic defamiliarization. We will come to these examples and these images in the next few weeks. So one of you mentioned grotesque. You may find these images grotesque, not sure. They are all attempts at different scientific renderings of the human body according to different criteria than we normally use for measuring the body, the human body, in terms of its extension in space. So these are often called a homunculus, which I also think I mentioned in the introductory video. So perhaps this is a kind of somatic or bodily or corporeal defamiliarization. And somatic, soma in Greek is body. This is another interesting book which we can touch upon later on in the course, which talks about estrangement and the somatics of literature. Estrangement is sometimes used for this concept as well, but we can talk about the differences around those terms. Okay, this is one type of defamiliarization. Here's another one, sensory defamiliarization. So we have here lots of colors, lots of numbers, and different kinds of spectra and different kinds of scales. So we have there a keyboard, as in a keyboard of a piano, with a different color assigned to each note. And that is a real invention of a composer from the early 20th century, Alexander Scriabin, who invented what he called the chromola. And this is the color keyboard, which he invented for a specific performance of a piece he composed called Prometheus, Poem of Fire. So it was called Poem of Fire, but it was a musical piece. And he believed that each of these keys on the piano, on the keyboard, were represented by a particular color. So that's a kind of synesthetic process of aligning a color with a note or a pitch or a frequency. So that is arguably a kind of sensory defamiliarization. And the condition of synesthesia is a kind of condition where you experience your senses in a defamiliarized way. This is also something which we will talk about. Okay, another kind, post-human defamiliarization. One of you mentioned transhumanism. This is very interesting when we talk about both of these concepts, transhumanism, post-humanism, both interesting and both relevant to thinking about defamiliarization. So we have a philosopher here, contemporary thinker, Rosie Braidotti. And in her book, The Posthuman, in 2013, she writes about defamiliarization as she sees it. So she says, the post-anthropocentric shift away from the hierarchical relations that had privileged man requires a form of estrangement and a radical repositioning on the part of the subject. The best method to accomplish this is through the strategy of defamiliarization, or critical distance from the dominant vision of the subject. So in this example, we have, rather than an object being defamiliarized, it's the dominant vision of the subject that is being defamiliarized. So this is really interesting. It's a different way of thinking about the same process. And again, we will talk about this in the coming weeks, but a critical distance from the dominant vision of the subject is a different way of thinking about what you can do with this device. Okay, so we have lots of different angles so far, but if you're maybe thinking to yourself, why queer defamiliarization? Because this is what my book was called, Queer Defamiliarization. Well, this is a question I asked myself a lot when I was writing that book. And here we have a musician, pop artist, Ezra Furman. Some of you may know them or have heard of Ezra Furman, who wrote a biography of a much older, or now no longer with us, musician Lou Reed, also quite a queer figure, saying, and Furman says, I propose that for folks like me and Lou, the real meaning of queerness is defined by continual transformation. So this is an interesting description, something which we will also come back to in the next few weeks, continual transformation. So what if that device that I described was always happening? There was always transformation happening. A little bit more on the idea of queer defamiliarization, going back to Shklovsky, who we will look at more next week, in a different book of his, he writes, and the book is called Knight's Move. If you know chess, you will know the way that the knight moves on the chessboard. He says, the knight is not free. It moves in an L-shaped manner because it is forbidden to take the straight road. So this is a very interesting example of how a movement could be defamiliarized. The knight on the chessboard moves in a kind of vertical and then horizontal, or horizontal and then vertical move. So the movements are perpendicular to one another because it's not allowed to go straight. So that's a really, there are reasons why Shklovsky writes this, which we can go into more detail at a later stage. But I find this really interesting when you think about, again, what does queer have to do with defamiliarization? We have a queer performer here based in the UK called Travis Alabanza, who wrote in a text in 2017, "To be trans, black and femme is a constant obstacle course. It is to be in continuous movement dictated from the track." So continuous movement, again, similar to that previous example, continual transformation, this idea of continual movement. But continuous movement dictated from the track. So the inability to take the straight road and therefore to take a defamiliarized route. This is one way we can think about queer defamiliarization. Okay. Another philosopher who is useful for this, Sarah Ahmed, she wrote this book, Queer Phenomenology, Orientations, Objects, Others. She also writes about this kind of defamiliarization device. She calls it at one point a disorientation device, which is also quite interesting, I think. She says, the point is not to pledge allegiance to the familiar, but to make that familiar strange, or even to allow that which has been overlooked, that which has been treated as furniture, to dance with renewed life. So if something is treated as furniture, we don't perceive a piece of furniture every time we see it. We don't see this in a creative and aesthetic way. Often furniture is a functional object, something we sit on. You sit, the chair you're sitting on right now, for example, you don't experience this in an exciting aesthetic way every time you sit on it. However, if you defamiliarize it, then you do perceive it in this new exciting way, and it dances with renewed life. So this is a nice example from Sarah Ahmed of this process. And this is a helpful way that I have found to think about these concepts, queering as defamiliarizing. In the process of queering, as in the process of defamiliarizing, subjects or objects or things or structures are liberated from the strictures of their preconceived reference and permitted multiple potential reorientations. So there's a kind of liberation going on in these processes. And as you can see, they are creative processes as well. Okay, so these are some different angles, and what I have gathered together now, just because you are architecture students, I thought that I would find some buildings which I don't know if we want to call them defamiliarized buildings or not, but maybe I will just kind of go through the next, I don't know, 9 or 10 buildings, and you can think to yourselves, Is this a defamiliarized building? You might recognize some of them. Buildings from around the world. We have one here. And just take a look at these images and think to yourselves, is this defamiliarized? And if so, what is happening with this building to make me think that it is a defamiliarized building? Is it something about the shape? Is it something about the function? Is it something about the position? Is it something about a juxtaposition between where the building is and what it looks like? Is it perhaps something that the building is looking like, that the building is resembling something else in the world that is possibly a different kind of defamiliarization? What does the building look like? So these are different examples. Is it something amusing? Is it something strange or surreal? Is it something unexpected? Is it something about the dimensions or the geometric shape that the building has assumed that is not exactly what we think of when we think of a building? Is it resembling something organic? Is it a synthesis of something organic in the world? This is a pineapple, a building which has a pineapple on it. I mean, is this a defamiliarized building? Is it something about curves as opposed to straight lines? Is it something about colors? Is it something about strange proportions? Is it something about the scale of grandeur inside a building? Is it something about the structure